But what we didn't really understand about the brain is how the brain recovers and what happens when people have devastating neurological conditions.
Hey TID fam, welcome to season 2 of the Invisible Diaries. We're your hosts, Misty and Amber. I'm Misty from MistyBlueDream.com, a chronic illness lifer with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and a congenital heart warrior. I am a biomedical major, writer, mom, and advocate.
And I'm Amber from the autoimmuneadvocate.com. I'm a mom, health coach, advocate, and fellow chronic illness warrior. And together we created the Invisible Diaries to shed light on invisible and chronic illnesses through education, advocacy, and awareness.
The Invisible Diaries isn't just about sharing our story, but also including each and every one of yours. But first, a quick disclaimer. Any information discussed in this podcast is strictly our opinion and for informational purposes only. It is not meant as medical advice and should not be taken that way. Always consult with your doctor or medical team.
We know battling chronic illness can be hard, and if you find yourself or someone you love in crisis and need someone to talk to, you can call the National Suicide Support Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, which provides free and confidential support in the U.S. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, that number is 1-800-273-TALK.
Any cited resources mentioned will be linked on our website, theinvisiblediaries.com. Now let's get started.
Dr. Nedd is a board-certified neurologist with subspecialty training in neurological rehabilitation and neurotrauma. He currently serves as the managing partner of Design Neuroscience Center, a comprehensive brain injury center involved in the evaluation and treatment of individuals with traumatic brain injury and other neurological disorders.
Dr. Nedd developed the Brain Hierarchical Evaluation and Treatment Method, or BHET. BHET considers the hierarchical organization of the brain and how this order is impacted by injury and the recovery process. Dr. Nedd has also written a book called Concussion, Traumatic Brain Injury from Head to Tail, which explores how this modern epidemic is often misdiagnosed or left untreated.
Dr. Nedd, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on such an important topic. I know we may have lost a few of our listeners on that incredible bio of yours, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the field of neurological rehab and neurotrauma.
Well, thank you. So to answer your question, I was trained in neurology first. From as much as I could remember myself, I had an interest in the brain and how the brain worked. And after completing college, I went to medical school and I was really impressed by the nervous system for my medical school education. And when I completed my training, what I found out was that we knew a lot about the brain, and it was an evolving science at the time I got involved. But what we didn't really understand about the brain is how the brain recovers and what happens when people have devastating neurological conditions. And because of the social stigma attached to mental health and people with brain injury, the science of recovery in brain injury, particularly from a research perspective, has been poorly developed. For example, most studies on brain injury go less than a year when you follow people longitudinally. So you don't see a person through all of the natural cycles that they go through in the recovery process. They live 30, 40 years after their brain injury, even longer. So we don't clearly understand all of the different steps. And again, that's one of the reasons when I started learning about the brain, I was particularly interested in the hierarchical. Hierarchical means you go from head to tail, or how the brain is organized, looking at it from the highest order of organization to the lowest order of organization, and how the brain gets injured and heals in that process. The other thing I understood was that the treatment modalities available did not take this type of organization of the brain into consideration. And therefore, we would attack or treat the brain inappropriately. For example, we will administer treatment at the wrong time because of a lack of understanding of the nature of injury and the recovery process, where you are at any point in time. Think about this. This is the most complicated disease of the most complex organ system in your body. I mean, this is what rules the universe, if you really think about it. And when you injure that, the disorganization, the proportionate disorganization of the brain is directly related to the degree of functionality or disruption in functionality. So that sort of proportionate relationship allows you to know how severe it is, and during the recovery process to understand where you are at all stages of recovery. And so my task as a neuroscientist in writing this book was to pen this type of philosophy in showing the world how this approach could really transform the field of brain injury. That's why I wrote the book.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That is great. So I have a couple questions for you. I wanted to ask real quick, as far as an injury goes, I feel like a lot of times we think a brain injury is something that's very severe and very obvious, like a car accident, you're in a coma or something, you know, that you would see in a movie. Can you touch base on what an injury might look like that is easy to miss?
Well, fascinating you bring this up. I recently saw a patient that came to me for some symptoms, and it was a football player. I'm coming to realize that after we chat, that he had a recent football injury, but he didn't realize that he had an injury when he was a child. And that injury actually impacted his entire life, all of his decisions. He was classified as having attention deficit. You know, one of the things he told me, he said, Dr. Nedd, I always ask my patients this question. Have you ever read a book from cover to cover? Sometimes that's a real telltale sign that that person have not enough attention span to be able to complete a book. It's a simple test. And most of the people with attention disorder, they're actually quite intelligent, but they would not have read a book from cover to cover because their attention span is so short that they can't get to the end of most things in their lives. And so that's the mishap. So he couldn't finish high school, didn't go to college, but became a practical in his life where he started working in the business of horticulture while he was still playing football, of course, and got a second injury. But he said that I love being in the outdoors. He didn't understand why until he realized that he didn't have the attention span to sit in a classroom. But that came from an injury that occurred when he was age 7. This is the real story about people with brain injury, and we don't understand the impact that this condition has on the entire society. If you look at the prison population as an example, right now, between 62 and 95% of people who are incarcerated had a traumatic brain injury, enough to have lost consciousness. Wow. And look at how much this disorder impacts on our interpersonal relationships, our ability to succeed in life, form friends and maintain relationships, perform well on the job and complete the task, be able to get into relationships that are healthy, make decisions about our finances. We don't realize that some of these childhood events that took place impact our ability to mature and grow and acquire the necessary social skills, academic skills. And I have people today that are adults in their 50s and 60s that are still living with the consequences of a TBI as a child. I mean, this is such a life-changing event. I mean, many times you get a hit on the head, you go to the emergency room, you get seen by a pediatrician, they say to you, oh, it's over. Not to realize that this simple
It's just begun.
Exactly. Could take a lifetime.
So why is traumatic brain injury such an under-recognized and underdiagnosed condition, and what inspired you to develop your unique approach, the BHET method?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of myths about brain injury out there. a lot. And that the myths come from the doctors, the people in the medical community, the therapists. It comes from the lawyers in the legal profession. It comes from the patients, their family. It comes from the politicians, the policymakers, about what a brain injury is. Over the years, we've had very poor definitions of what a concussion is or a traumatic brain injury. Similar to the tobacco industry, we didn't believe that tobacco caused cancer. Now we understand that. For years, the brain injury was not a signature of war until the Afghanistan war. All the people in the military that come back from war that suffer from the effects of brain injury went unrecognized. And all of these people go back into society without having proper treatment. Then look at the football players who are the other contact sports who have suffered. And I take care of these patients post their injury. Many of them are suffering the effects of injury on their lives. And until now, they've not been recognized.
So I'm glad that you brought that up, because I know your book touches on CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which many of us, like myself, learned about after the movie Concussion with Will Smith came out in 2015. I know that movie opened my eyes to the risk of repeated head injury and just how important protecting our brains from trauma, especially repeated trauma, is from an early age on. So do you have any advice for our listeners out there who may have children who play sports or who might have played contact sports themselves as a child that might be concerned about TBI or CTE?
I got lots of advice. Well, first, I'll tell you this. We as a society fail to understand how important it is after we suffer an injury to not return to play, first of all, prematurely. The brain, especially the young brain, needs time to heal. And if you prematurely return to play when you're not ready to, the pressure of sports, the pressure of that personal gain of feeling victorious is so important to us as humans. And we would want that feeling at all cost. We first have to understand that there's a cost to that. And the second is that when you, after a person suffers a traumatic brain injury, first is to recognize that the effects of those injuries occur and understand how that injury affects you now and into the future. To parents, what I say is that the younger the brain is in relation to being exposed to the effects of traumatic brain injury, is the more enduring the effects. So a person that may have suffered a traumatic brain injury or concussion pre-puberty, the effects are more long-lasting and more severe because that brain is not well developed yet. There's something about the brain being able to recover after it has laid down its basic tracks. It recovers better. Now, clearly, the young brain is more neuroplastic, meaning that it has the ability to regenerate faster and easier. But the idea is that if you have not at a critical age laid down those pathways, it's very difficult to acquire those pathways in the long term. So the young brain is most subject to the effects of injury. The next is this whole issue of prevention. How do we prevent ourselves from being injured? And that's another topic on its own in terms of what we do in contact sports to prevent injuries from occurring, what gears we wear, how long we expose players to repeated injury, when to, I alluded to this before, when to come out from playing, and what type of sports should a young person be involved in, and then when to say when. Look at the boxing industry. Many of the boxers, they keep coming back and coming back to the sport, even though they've had injuries in the past. And what we've seen is this string of boxers over the years who are now suffering the effects of dementia. Muhammad Ali being the notorious example of this. So clearly, it's important that when you consider the long-term effects of repeated injury to the brain, that we adhere to these basic principles of first, prevention. Second, if you're injured, then don't go back into play before completely recovering. And third, the whole idea of at what age should a person be exposed to contact sports and to the degree to which they should be exposed. Very important to be considered in our society. And of course, one more thing I should say, we are constantly changing the nature of the game, how we play, what protective measures that we include in sports. And the last point is in the military. We know that the US government and others have been paying attention to what happens to soldiers, particularly with blast injuries. And it's important that we recognize that our returning soldiers need to be evaluated and checked before we let them back to their families and into society where they suffer the ill effects of these repeated injuries.
So true. I'm so glad that you bring up, because a lot of people don't think about traumatic brain injury and mental health. They kind of see them as two separate issues. And so I love that you really highlight that they're really part of the same issue, because our overall health is, and our overall goal is to be the healthiest versions of ourselves. And so in acknowledging that injury is a part of mental health, I think is huge.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Awesome.
So I have a vocabulary question, because I hear the term plasticity often, and Amber and I have kind of gone over that for a while and we're familiar with it, but I'd like to see if you could define that for our listeners.
Well,
brain plasticity.
I just did a vlog on this whole subject of plasticity, so you
Cool.
can listen to that on my website. But
yeah, we'll share that
We'll
link
link it
too in our blog post as well.
it's how the brain restores itself. And it does that at many different levels. The brain is constantly trying to go back to a state that it was before. The brain likes patterns. It likes to go back to that state. Even though sometimes we never quite get back. We're never the same as we were yesterday. And the brain exercises some measures at a basic molecular level, at the cellular level, to restore itself. And part of it is just about how the brain reorganizes itself to function. And that's what plasticity is all about. So we have an ideal state that we want to be at so we could become functional, and the brain tries to restore to that. And that's simply what neuroplasticity is about. Now, to do this, the brain has certain chemicals. They're neurotropic products. There's one called BDNF. They call them nerve growth factors, and they allow brain cells to regenerate. They also help to scavenge or remove debris and waste products from the nervous system so that the brain could actually heal itself. Cells could regrow. The brain could start producing the neurochemicals that are necessary to make us function. These are all involved, certainly the way the receptors work and how they regenerate in terms of how they receive messages. All of those biological, physiological processes are important to the restoration of how the brain would recover. What we see at the end in terms of things like how do we develop and restore body cycles? Because obviously one of the first things that happens when the brain becomes disorganized is that the natural cycles that we have in our nervous system also becomes disrupted. So think about sleep as an example. Your sleep-wake cycle is one of the most critical part of your existence as a human being. Sleep is such an important element in our society, and people with attention deficit disorder have sleep disorders. They have trouble, they don't dream, they have trouble with REM sleep. REM sleep is a restorative sleep. It's how you prune the brain and prepare your brain for the next day of activities. So if you don't have those natural cycles in your body, which is disrupted by the physiological effects of injury, then your entire day becomes disrupted. So one of the targets of our approach to treating is in this hierarchical organization is to restore body cycles. How your body manages energy. When do you feel fatigue? All the hormonal cycles that your body has within it, your menstrual cycle, your hunger cycle, your mood cycle, all of those cycles becomes disrupted. And this is what makes us truly human. That makes us truly alive. So our goal in terms of the BHET method, as we call it, is to look at this hierarchical organization of the brain, understand where we are, and provide the appropriate models to restore the brain to the most perfect working cycles through this process of neuroplasticity. And we use a lot of interventions to be able to achieve these goals. And I believe, in my experience of 30 years plus years treating brain injury, exercising this type of model brings a lot of hope to our future in terms of the evaluation and treatment of people with brain disorders, particularly brain injury, TBI.
Wow,
Absolutely.
that's incredible.
So I do have another question. Sorry, they're just coming to my head. I have twins, and they were born prematurely at 28 weeks, and they're 17 now, healthy and tall and all grown up. But
well, you look like
thank you. But being born at 28 weeks, they both had severe brain bleeds. One side on one was a 3 and a 4 grade on the other. So they were pretty severe, but they were fortunate enough to not have to have a shunt or have any, I mean, like I said, they're doing well. But I'm curious about preemies and like brain health, is that something like that would be considered a traumatic brain injury with the brain bleed?
Well, this is a very good question that you ask. And what we know about the bleeds that occur in the preemies, in the long term, they're not as devastating as bleeds that occur later on. And partly because the brain at this stage is still in the formative stage. And so the brain has enough time to make corrections. So that by the time you get to 7 or 8, it's developed enough that, and part of what happens in the early stage of brain development, understand that the cells in the brain are migrating and multiplying. They migrate from the center to the edge. And during this process of migration is how they make these connections. So if you disrupt the template, so to speak, then obviously the recovery from the brain would be less. But when there is a hemorrhage, the hemorrhage gets reabsorbed, and many times the cells are not as disrupted. And that path that the cells lay down in terms of migration oftentimes are preserved. So that's why kids who are born prematurely actually do well with good medical care, even when they have injury from hemorrhages. So those are less impactful. So you would find that persons that with preemie will do well. But in many cases, if you really truly evaluate those kids, you do find some areas of deficiencies, but they tend to do much better than a child that would be, say, injured between 7 and 12.
Wow, thank you. I love that your goal is to give those with traumatic brain injury a voice and hope. So tell everyone how they can find you and your book and learn more about the incredible work that you're doing.
Well, they could. We're in Miami, Florida. My center is called Design Neuroscience Center. You could find us on concussiontbi.com, or you could call our office. It's 305-653-5155. That's one other way to get me. My book you could find on Amazon. It's on most of the outlets, Apple Books. You'll find it on various outlets, but the main one right now it's Amazon. Archway Publishing is the publishing company. You could find it on their site also. So various ways you could get it online, both the ebook and the hardcover. But certainly in reaching us, if someone wants to talk to us, we're also available on Facebook, on Instagram. I'll say concussiontbi.com is our website, and we're producing a lot of content for the public. free, of course, that they could access, that'll spread the word about brain injury as a silent epidemic. And so,
Love it.
We will have everything linked for everybody. So for our listeners that may be driving their car, don't worry. We will have everything linked to Dr. Nedd's websites and all of the various ways to find him and his incredible book.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Nedd.
Thank you guys for listening, and as always, we ask that you leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to.
Also, make sure you are following us on Instagram and Facebook for the latest updates, and subscribe to our website where you'll find all the details from today's podcast, as well as other amazing resources. Don't forget to check out our latest issue of the Invisible Diaries magazine.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you want to share your story or be featured as a Spoonie Spotlight, you can apply on our website, theinvisiblediaries.com. Bye!